In the next segment of this seminar, I just want to go through the first step of any matter that you take on, either for the plaintiff or the defendant in your office, and that is what happens in the interview with the client. Under the ethical rules currently, you're required to obtain an identification of the client, and the reason for that is that there have been a lot of problems of people misidentifying themselves, especially in real estate situations, and these have caused a lot of issues of fraud and other issues that we should be aware of. So I think we should be very aware of which person are we dealing with. So the first step that you're taking when you meet the client, either as a plaintiff or as a defendant, then the first thing that you want to do is to check his identity. Very often, as your practice progresses, you will know the clients. Like in my case, I've been there for 40 plus years, and very often, or rather most of the time, I know the person I'm dealing with. But I think in terms of formality, you would still take an ID, a driver's license, but you have an idea in your mind who the client is, and if it's a new client and you're a young practitioner, then you definitely want to get to know the client. And getting to know the client is very important, the first meeting. So there is, in my view, we are in an advisory role in dealing with the client, and there is a certain amount of understanding in the mind of the client that you are there as a knowledgeable professionals in advising the client. But important thing to recognize is that the client is getting to know you, that are you there sufficiently competent to carry out the task that the client is asking you to carry out. So that meeting, in my case, for example, I treat it very carefully in terms of giving the opportunity to the client to assess you as a lawyer or a paralegal, and then moving forward to understand what is the story and how do you deal with that particular story. So I think from the story point of view, it is very important that as the client is narrating the facts to you, you have to begin to identify the legal categories in which you're going to put the client in, and that is of fundamental importance. So I want to address a couple of remarks for young lawyers or paralegals that have just come out of school, and how does this process begin? My observation of the way the law is taught in the schools and universities is that we learn by categories. I want to give you an example of, let's say, tort law, contract law, or statutory provision that is something that the client wants you to deal with. So the most important thing is that as the client narrates that story, you begin to identify the question marks from the legal point of view. So when you get some more experience, I saw in my case that you begin to understand that in certain categories of the law, you will begin to get more practice and begin to identify the issue from a certain point of view. Let me give you a couple of examples. One example that comes up in the small claims court is you give a contract to somebody to repair your basement. You knew the person because he was a neighbor, had done the job for somebody else very nicely. You trusted him. He came, he started, and then asked you for certain items. You paid for the disbursements, and then suddenly he opened up the wall and found something different than he anticipated. The whole arrangement, agreement, now becomes a different issue and a different problem altogether. Namely, the original cost of what you were going to do turns out very different because something new happened, you never wrote the contract, you end up in a small claims court. So how do you deal with that? So the first question that you would ask the client when the problem is brought to you is the question of the category in which you're going to bring this particular problem in. Is it a contract? What was the value of the repair of the basement? What is it that the damages are? because you had to have that basement completed by somebody else, and therefore that's the loss amount. And so these categories in your mind should begin to come up in your mind so that you can ask the relevant questions to the client, make your notes, open a file, and you begin to address that issue by telling the client that you have a particular kind of a cause of action, and how good is it without an agreement, or if you had an agreement that is being breached, who is at fault, and therefore what is the likelihood that you will recover the damages. So that assessment and ability to identify the problem takes some practice. Most of the time in the law schools that I saw is that the teaching is done by a separate category of theory of law, such as the tort law, the contract law. But the formulation of your view of how it will pan out for resolution of the problem and identifying the category of the law within which you're going to deal with the issue is not always very clear. So it takes some practice, and I think most importantly, as you get more experienced, you will see that the problems in real life do not come about in the neat packages in which we learn the law. So what I found from my experience, in not only in the practice, but also in helping many of the members of the Angel Mentorship Group whom I have taught, the key thing that I learned is that it takes some time and practice for the new person in the profession to learn these categories and begin to identify how do you create a story from which you have legal categories in which you're going to put the problem. So the first thing I recommend in this case, which is my method of dealing with it, is that if you have a student or a person supporting you, you write out a working memorandum, identify the cause of action. In that meeting, you identify that in the meeting, prepare a retainer, and I suggest that the retainer be drafted in very specific terms to identify what is the problem that you think that the client wants you to solve. Then write the retainer and then have the client sign so that the issues are clear in your mind, and you created expectation in the mind of the client as to how you'll solve that problem, and then you proceed with the action. So I think the most important part of the first interview is summarizing that it is not just you telling the client and advising, but also the client assessing what you have to say, and that you have the skill, the knowledge, and the ability to identify the legal problems that the client has brought to you and how you're going to deal with that particular